close discussion. So in as you heard from the very generous introductions, Emily, Josh, and I all work together as a part of a group called the Coalition Against Predictive Policing. And all of us are, of course, students at Carnegie Mellon, and joined that work because Carnegie Mellon was developing predictive policing tools, and that really motivated a lot of these lines of questioning. And to really start off, the um, the presentation, we wanted to bring to the forefront the power of narrative and storytelling. So particularly, this is a very powerful and ever-present version of a narrative that's presented to us, which is that surveillance equals safety. Um, but when we start to dig into that, surveillance equals safety presentation, we have to ask, surveillance of who and by who, and whose safety is surveillance guaranteeing and whose danger is that safeguarding against? Particularly, what's the underlying power dynamic of where safety is granted and for who again? So of course, this past summer, with the really powerful movement and an outcry for change, one of the phrases that we like to return to is from a really powerful grassroots organization in LA, and they refer to the idea that this is not a moment in time, but a continuation of history. So all these struggles that are happening now, of course, is coming off of work that has already been done through the ages, um, and of course, the power again of narrative and of storytelling brings us to this quote, where of course Frederick Douglass was addressing an abolitionist org after the 13th Amendment passed, and this organization was considering disbanding, that its work had been done. And within his speech, there's this really powerful quote that applies to questions around policing technology development, which is that you and I and all of us had better wait and see in what new skin this old snake will come forth next. And of course, in talking about old snakes, he was talking about slavery, but these old oppressions come in new forms and new skins. And that is particularly relevant not just when it comes to technology, but in thinking about all the ways that oppression comes disguised in language and in policy and other dimensions of life. So how racism is often disguised as protecting economic interests, right? Following someone in a store, you're just concerned for your wares, or xenophobia being disguised in the name of protecting the state. So calling people terrorists or implementing inhumane, domestic policies are justified, in the name of protecting the state, when underlying that is the snake of xenophobia. And when it comes to technology, this is sort of another dimension of all of those same narratives. And what actually happens with technology is that it augments in all these different directions. So there's actually a big data trope called the 4 Vs, and usually it's used in businesses and marketing as, this great thing about big data. But what big data also does for surveillance is it increases the availability of both private and public data sets. It makes that surveillance data quick and accessible and actionable. And it also means that it comes in a lot of different forms, a lot of different places that many of us would not have expected to be surveilled. So for example, social media is a place where a lot of data comes from that maybe many of us do not think about. Free devices in the home, such as a Google Nest or Amazon Doorbell, all of these are connected to data streams. And finally, what data does for these um, for policing tech is giving an appearance of objectivity that in deploying a piece of software, that it's not a person who's being biased anymore. It's actually just a software and it's all objective. So all of this can be sort of answered with an amazing scholar named Simone Brown. She wrote a book called Dark Matters on the history of surveillance in anti-Blackness. And one of the earliest examples of technology being used to perpetuate old oppressions was the Lantern Law. There was a slave revolt in New York City in 1712, and the very next year, as a way of cracking down, the New York City Council passed the law for regulating um, Negro and Indian peoples in the nighttime. And this tool required that all Black and Brown people carry a lantern after dark, or be faced with a possible punishment, which any citizen could enforce and drag in someone after dark. So this lantern was an early tool, an early form of technology that was used to augment oppression. And of course, again, thinking back to the surveillance equals safety narrative, unfortunately, when we think about the ways that surveillance has been most widely used, the biggest example is usually the COINTELPRO operation, which existed in the 50s to early 70s. It was a direct FBI operation that targeted social movements and anti-war movements, and often many of them youth-based orgs. So folks like the Black Panther Party, the Young Lords, and many, many other social movements that are not pictured here. And all of this came to one, conflict point in New York when 21 members of the Black Panther Party were charged on false conspiracy charges that were the result of intense targeting from the FBI under COINTELPRO and with aid from local law enforcement from the NYPD. And it was actually during the trial of these 21 Black Panther Party members that it was revealed just how extensive that surveillance was, and it actually sparked outrage. So the next year, the same lawyers representing the Panther 21 countersued the police department. And what resulted from that case was what's called the Handshoe Agreement, which was an early piece of policing accountability legislation that was trying to prevent the same type of surveillance of marginal groups. And it was named after the civil rights lawyer Barbara Handshoe, pictured here.
Awesome.
So the last bit is the, you know, the resurgence of, unfortunately, surveillance of minority groups. Of course, after 9/11, the NYPD extensively surveilled Muslim communities, and actually in a very similar way to surveilling the Panther Party. Of course, in 2000, after 2011, they had a lot of new tools, so including things like automated license plate readers, right, which take photos of your license plate and read the characters and upload that to a database that police and other law enforcement organizations can read. And they use this to track community members to their homes or to mosques and just really private spaces that they had no business in being in. So another lawsuit in 2012 successfully sued the NYPD in a follow-up, actually reopening up the same handshoe case that was from the Panther Party case. And so it resulted in new updated policing accountability measures to the handshoe law. And so it shows that all these are tied together, and there's something to be said for the solidarity amongst movements with that history. And so none of this, of course, is ancient. Just last summer, a lot of protesters in Pittsburgh and elsewhere were targeted with many new surveillance tools as well. So following a particularly explosive in terms of tear gas, I would say, demonstration in East Liberty, there was a damage assessment and accountability task force. So you can again read into the damage terminology of that task force as this is created in the name of protecting property and economic interests, and protesters were tracked using social media, using facial recognition and other tools. So on the subject of policing technology, and going further into how it exacerbates biases in history, I'll turn it over to Josh.
Thank you, Bonnie. And yeah, let's just get started on the tech part. So like Bonnie mentioned, we got started on this work because in Pittsburgh, the city partnered with our school, Carnegie Mellon, to create a predictive policing program that was run through half of the city. And it did for 3 years, and there wasn't any public input, no notice or anything. And they specifically chose as a starting point the neighborhood of Homewood in Pittsburgh. And this is a neighborhood that's 97% Black. So we got engaged because of what we saw going on in Pittsburgh. And it's just really drawn us deeper into understanding what's been going on with the policing tech. And as we go through this presentation, I'm going to be using terms like machine learning and algorithm. And just quickly run through what those are, since this may be a very broad audience. A machine learning is just a way of using computers to find patterns in large amounts of data. And an algorithm is just instructions for if you receive some data or some input, how you get your desired output from it. So that's all those things are. We'll be using those terms quite a bit throughout this presentation. And so what the Pittsburgh police did is that Carnegie Mellon researchers connected with the police and were able to get data on 911 calls. They got past crime data. They got anything that they could really get their hands on for violent crimes. And then they used these machine learning algorithms to find patterns in this data in order to say, within this specific 600 by 600 foot block of the city, next Tuesday, there will be a large spike in crime. So officers need to go to that 600 by 600 foot block. And then it took all the locations of these spikes in crimes, which are also called hotspots, and they generated a map to give to the police every week. And the police were deploying extra patrols based on these hotspots every week. And we can go on. And it might sound okay where police are just, if you can find out where crime happens, what crime will happen before it starts, like something out of the movie Minority Report. But there are a lot of problems with this that we'll start to go into. And the first and probably one of the biggest problems here is that machine learning doesn't predict the future, it replicates the past. Machine learning algorithms are strongly tied to the data that are used to train it. And if the data, especially arrest data, is steeped in our country, and especially Pittsburgh's racist legacy, the machine learning algorithm is going to replicate it. It's going to find the patterns of racism that led to the current arrest data we have and start replicating it. And so you can just do this, do the same thing your data's already been doing. And then it's also a profit-driven way of perpetuating police bias because people create companies that use these technologies. And so people will create a company, sell the tech to the police, and just make a profit by telling the police to keep doing what they've been doing or to focus more on going to Black neighborhoods or poor neighborhoods or anything like that. And when third-party reports have looked at these companies, there's been no tangible effect on public safety. It's just been a way of taking tax dollars and giving them to companies to tell police to keep policing Black and brown people more often. And lastly, this gives a veil of objectivity, like Bonnie mentioned, on the same policing practices. Because if police start using AI and machine learning, instead of being able to say the policing practices for the city are racist, they can point to a computer and say, well, how is math racist? We're just following what the computer tells us to do. It's not us, it's the algorithm. So all of these start causing a lot of problems when we start to think about predictive policing. And when the data is given to a machine learning algorithm, you have to think of it in the context of our history and how we got that data in the first place. So starting back in 1934, the practice of redlining started intertwining race and location, and it started divesting from and denying upward mobility to Black neighborhoods. So as a result of this, we get effects like Boston, in which the average net worth in 2015 of white families was $250,000, and the average net worth for Black families was $8. So this race wealth gap is going to start being encoded in the data that's used for these algorithms. And then we move on to the 70s and 80s, and we get the war on drugs, mandatory minimums, an increase in race-based arrest. And we start tying race with our arrest data. And we start tearing families apart for longer and longer periods of time. And it starts being hard to recover. And the data we have starts being filled with saying Black and brown people are just arrested and they're criminals. And then if we move into 1993, we get broken windows policing. And in broken windows policing, police wanted to find crime based on how well kept the neighborhoods are. And if you start comparing neighborhoods where one group of people are making $250,000 a year and one $8, you can't police based on the quality of these neighborhoods. It's incomparable. But broken windows policing was trying that, and it drove up the arrests for petty crimes and started associating neighborhoods that have already been torn apart by social policies with crime, regardless of its severity. Move on. And we want to talk a little bit more about broken windows policing because this mentality is what gives us these predictive policing technologies. And in New York, where broken windows policing sort of gave us stop and frisk, over that period where stop and frisk was in use, we saw increase in police misconduct. We saw dramatically increased misdemeanor arrests. There were huge impacts on people of color, in which 87% of all stop and frisks were Black and Latino, and 90% of those stopped were innocent. And then if we look at how violent crime changed over the period in which stop and frisk was in effect, New York did have a decrease in which the police looked to tout, but it decreased at the same rate of every other major city in the country. And none of these other cities had stop and frisk policies. So it wasn't as a result of stop and frisk. What happened was that these broken windows policies just led to more and more arrests of Black and brown people. And go on. So machine learning is just finding patterns in the past to make predictions based on this data and this racist arrest data, our history that we have. And so when we get these patterns and we try to find these patterns, we also come to the fact that arrest reports don't show where crime happens. So on these, we have two maps here of drug use in Oakland. On the left, we have just drug use based on hospital and NIH data, and it's sort of spread all throughout the city. And on the right, we have drug arrests in the city. And these drug arrests are all concentrated on one specific neighborhood, or one specific predominantly Black area. So if you try to use arrest data in order to predict future crime, you're not going to be getting a map like on the left that tells you to go all over the city. It's going to be telling you to go right back to this one neighborhood, keep going here. And it's going to create a cycle where police keep going there and justifying what they're doing because the algorithm tells them to. And even if the idea that, okay, well, we can start just focusing on these neighborhoods, third-party reports found that predictive policing doesn't work. In Chicago, they use these similar techniques in order to use machine learning to give a list of individuals who have a high likelihood of being involved in shootings. And the report by the RAND Corporation found that there was no difference in likelihood of being involved in a shooting, whether you were you on that list and the AI told you, or the machine learning algorithm told you that this person's gonna be involved in a shooting, whether you're off the list. But what happened was that the police had been using this list of individuals in order to close cases. There was higher rates of arrest if you were on that list. And there have been a lot of other reports about predictive policing done too, but so many of these are steeped in conflicts of interest. For example, the Los Angeles predictive policing program was started by a professor at UCLA, in which she authored a paper that argued that predictive policing wasn't biased and would not bias against people of color, or specifically Black people. And then he went on to form a company called Predpol Inc. in order to profit from it, so he could use his own paper to justify the fact the police should be using it. So all of this goes into the fact that predictive policing has huge problems, but it's not the only policing tech that we're focusing on as well. And I'll pass the torch off to Emily to go into facial recognition.
Thanks so much, Josh. Yeah, so predictive policing is one form of surveillance tech that police have access to, and facial recognition, that's getting a lot of press in the news recently, is another. So what exactly is facial recognition and how does it work? Facial recognition is a method of identifying people based off of pictures obtained of them. So how it works in the law enforcement context is say that a police officer wants to identify someone in an investigation. So there's this database of pictures, like this database here on the left of all these little pictures of people that's connected to information about them, like their name, address, any other thing that you might have like on your driver's license or something like this. And then the police will upload a picture to the system, like the one on the right here, that maybe they got off Instagram or somehow through their investigation about some person. And the algorithm will try to match the picture that's uploaded to the picture in the database. Right, and so it'll come up to be something like this. So the picture was matched and it matches to some picture in the database that comes up with information about that individual to quote unquote proceed with the investigation or whatever they want to do. So how is facial recognition actually used by law enforcement in the US? I'm going to talk about how it's used in Pittsburgh as an example of how it works in the US generally. The main way that the police departments have access to facial recognition is through state-run systems such as JNet in Pennsylvania. JNet is a facial recognition system like the one from the previous slides with a database of pictures of people from all across Pennsylvania. The database consists of mugshots from correctional facilities across the state, but also more recently, since this was decided to be not enough photos, it has pictures off of the transportation system as well, PennDOT. So everyone who has a driver's license from the state of Pennsylvania is also entered in the system that can be searched over by the police at any time. That's just in Pennsylvania, but actually half of US states have such a system, most of them including people's driver's licenses and that information in the database. So it actually comes out to the fact that 1 in 2 Americans is in a database that police can search. And this is often referred to as a perpetual lineup. Of course, there are also other ways that facial recognition is used too. One example is through installing surveillance cameras equipped with facial recognition technology. That can even monitor people in real time sometimes. So in Pittsburgh, the district attorney's office, DePaula, engaged in trials with 2 different firms, Biometrica and Clearview AI, to try to do this with some of their surveillance cameras in Pittsburgh. It never ended up panning out, thankfully, but this is another kind of surveillance that, if it's not here already, is kind of always on the brink of happening in a lot of jurisdictions, including Pittsburgh. So that's this other pictures over here with the surveillance cameras and Clearview AI. I just wanted to emphasize, of course, that 1 in 2 Americans is in this perpetual lineup. So another way, actually, that's perhaps even closer to home that Bonnie hinted at earlier, that police can get access to our faces and to enter into a face recognition system, is through Amazon Ring doorbells. So for those of you who haven't heard, Amazon Ring doorbells are this doorbell that you can put on the outside of your house in case you don't have a doorbell that has a little camera on it, so you can see, maybe like they advertise it as, oh, you can see if your package is going to be stolen or who came to your house while you were gone or something like this. But really, Amazon Doorbell has partnered up with 400 police forces across the United States to have access to this footage when the police request it. And in fact, they also have it in Pittsburgh, but they have it again in 400 police systems across the state. So literally, the police have access to our faces from our doorstep off of technology that we're bringing into our homes. And of course, Amazon also is engaging in this narrative that Bonnie talked about earlier of surveillance equals safety, saying that like, oh, Your packages won't be stolen. You'll feel better knowing that the police are working with you to keep your neighborhood safe. But if we look at the actual data, Bonnie, you can go to the next slide, sorry. Having these systems don't actually increase safety, at least from what we've seen so far. Some of the most far-reaching, longest partnerships between Ring doorbells and the police, the ones that have extended since 2017, have not led to any reduction in crime, or feeling of safety. So, that really complicates the narrative of whether surveillance does equal safety. So I'm going to go in a little bit more detail into what exactly is wrong with facial recognition. And there are three main things that I want to talk about. First off is the risks are clear, but the benefits are not. Facial recognition use in law enforcement can hurt real people, and we'll see that it already has, but we don't know what benefit it's giving us. Second off, facial recognition implementations currently are biased against people of color, and that they're less accurate on people of color. And finally, just reiterating what Bonnie and Josh were saying from before, this is a new way to package old policing practices in new objective ways. So showing how the risks are clear but the benefits are not, this is Robert Julian Borchak Williams, and he was falsely accused by an algorithm, by a facial recognition algorithm. So he was falsely identified for a crime that he didn't commit. And actually the facial recognition system was so obviously wrong that even the police detectives on the case recognize that he was obviously the wrong person. But here's where the real harm comes in, is because once someone enters the criminal justice system, they don't just get to walk off, even if it was an algorithmic error. He was already entered for that crime. The judge set $1,000 bail, and he had to look for an attorney to defend him. And, entering as a Black man into the criminal justice system, there are all of these harms that are already present. All the attorneys assumed that he was guilty and were charging him $7,000, $8,000 to defend him when they probably were just going to make him take a plea deal. So thankfully, the ACLU picked up his case, and that didn't happen to him. But he was entered into this extremely dangerous situation through this algorithm. And he's not the only one. There have been at least 3 men that I know of who have been falsely accused by an algorithm, all men of color, and some had to give up their life savings to get through legal battles. It's the harms are very, very clear, but it's not just harms to individual people. There are also psychological studies that show that as a society, we change our behavior. We're more afraid to participate in activism and other things when we're being surveilled. So that's another harm. Now to see, I also said the algorithm itself is biased, and to see exactly how and how much we need to worry about this, I'm going to take you through quickly this ACLU test of facial recognition. So what the ACLU did was that they took pictures of the current members of Congress and ran it against a database of 26,000 mugshots of people who had criminal histories. And none of them were people of Congress. And they were trying to find how many members of Congress were identified as people in this mugshot database. And they found that 28 members of Congress came up as people in this database of mugshots. And the people of color in Congress were overrepresented. So since there are only 20% of people in Congress who are of color, but 39% of false matches in this algorithm were false matches on people of color. So it's at least twice as inaccurate from this test on people of color. But of course, it's not just the algorithm itself, it's also the way that we're using the algorithm, right? So we have the fact that there's higher error on Black faces, but we're also using this system on Black faces more often, both because the faces that make up the mugshot databases, if they're taken from correctional facilities, will disproportionately include Black faces, since Black people come into contact with the criminal justice system more than they should. And also through the fact that the actual cameras are put in Black neighborhoods. When we're thinking of surveillance of who by who, it's always surveillance of Black and brown bodies. So we can see that from this picture here. On the right, we have census data from Detroit, when this shows the different demographics of different neighborhoods. So the green area is a Black community, and then other colors are other ethnicities. So on the left, we have where the surveillance cameras for a large deployment of facial recognition equipped cameras were deployed in Detroit. And we can see that it essentially carves out exactly the Black neighborhood. So the cameras are being placed to surveil Black and brown bodies, and the system itself, the technology itself is flawed, putting it into a flawed system, just compounding the problems that already exist and extending the surveillance of Black and brown people. So that's on facial recognition. To summarize quickly about policing technology, predictive policing, and facial recognition, what we're trying to tell you here is that surveillance technology, it doesn't fix bias in law enforcement. It just repeats the past with a new veil of objectivity. Facial recognition does the same thing that predictive policing does in terms of giving you an objective algorithm that you can say, oh yeah, well, the algorithm said it was this person, so let's not question it too much. And on top of all of this, it uses money that we could be spending in other places to perpetuate this bias rather than actually increasing safety. So just all to say, all this technology, I think, is an old snake in new skin. I'm going to pass it over to Bonnie to finish up the presentation for us.
Right. So usually in presentations about surveillance, we don't want to leave with a sense of overwhelming dread and despondence. So there's an important part of thinking about what is our role, whatever role that is, as a community member, as an academic, or as a decision maker. One thing, because this is being presented in an academic context, our work evolved in response to academic complicity in developing these policing technologies without questioning their racist origins. So on the left, we have an example of Metro 21, that institute that developed the original Pittsburgh predictive policing algorithm, excluding members of the community in even discussing its implications, and in other ways perpetuating legacies of racist scholarship. On the right, there's an example from an event that was meant to address, again, UCLA's academic complicity in developing the predictive policing in their city, and particularly the academics that created the software, and how that feeds into gentrification and profiteering with the city. And the answer there is in listening to the voices on the ground and working in solidarity with grassroots orgs that recognize the real harms of those racist policing practices. So, for example, the gang database was mentioned in brief earlier. It was an evolution of predictive policing practices that put individuals on a list, and a strong coalition of organizations in Chicago, including Mi Gente and Communities Against Deportation and BYP 100, helped to actually stop that program. And on the right, there was a similar action taken against predictive policing in LA. So in terms of bringing it back, to our context, especially, in the regional deployments of policing technology that both Josh and Emily talked about, both predictive policing and facial recognition and more, it's important that we let history speak, and let grassroots work lead the way in responding critically to technology. But also what we found, especially in a lot of our work, is that there's very needed conversations amongst community members, amongst our community, amongst friends and family, everyone, in greater awareness about that connection, again, between technology and particularly policing technology and the racist legacy of policing. And that education is needed for decision makers as well. There are many people that we've talked to that held on to, again, that idea of surveillance equals safety. So we've taken enough time, talking on screen. We're hoping to now have some time to address the questions, the really great questions that popped up in chat, and any other